Welcome to The Claw. I'm Eric Holtzclaw, Chief Strategist at Liger. The Claw is the marketing podcast for C-suite executives. I am joined by a fellow Liger and also owner of his own business, Mike Petchenik. He's the owner and founder of Petchenik Media Group. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what Petchenik Media Group does.
Yeah, so I am a full-service media consultant. So we do everything from earned media, PR, media relations, to media training, to crisis communications if the need arises. Also produce marketing collateral, video production, things of that nature.
So this is going to be a fun conversation because the reason that I'm sitting in this seat doing this kind of craziness is because of a person like you. So years and years ago, I was running a company. I was like the guy behind the scenes who was the Wizard of Oz and made all the things happen. Mm-hmm. And the company had stopped scaling. Like we had hit a plateau. We couldn't get over it. So we brought in a company very similar to yours and said, hey, what should we do? And so they started looking around and they came to me, Mr. Wizard of Oz, that people didn't even know I kind of worked for the company, and said, you need to start standing on stages. Mm-hmm. You need to start being interviewed by people. You're the one who understands how all these things work. And I'm like, you're crazy. I'm an operational tech guy. I sit in the back. So one of the things that didn't happen for me, because I can distinctly remember there's a gas station near my house that I took my first radio interview from, like on my cell phone in the gas station. Not what I meant to have happen, but that's where I was. So I drive by it every day and I'm like, oh, that's where I did that first.
That's where it all began.
Horrible interview. So when you decide you want to do something like you're talking about, like the importance of getting people up to speed, like you shouldn't just throw anyone out there, right? Like
absolutely. Yeah. The person who you're putting forward needs to have a baseline understanding of what that means and what that looks like.
Yeah. So how does that happen? Like because that didn't happen for me. I'll be honest. Like that team was like, yeah, we'll get you in some interviews, and they did. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, typically, internally, you need to have a discussion with your team. Who is that person? Who's my spokesperson going to be? Is it the CEO, the CFO, head of HR? Do you have a PR person or an internal comms person who's going to handle that for you? And then once you've decided that, or you have a sort of a menu of options, then you can start training the folks that you want to put out there, the thought leaders you want to put on those stages and in front of those reporters.
Okay, and so talk to me about how that works. So what does training look like? What do I need to know? You know, where would you say to begin?
Absolutely. So, first of all, you're probably at that point already putting yourself out there trying to get earned media coverage, mm-hmm. trying to get reporters interested in your product, your brand, your service. And you need to decide, okay, if you're going to be the spokesperson, then we need to decide, okay, what's the message going to be? Then let's talk about the medium available to you. So is it going to be a podcaster? Is it going to be a tech trade publication? Is it going to be radio or television? Once you've sort of outlined all of that, then you sit down and you start talking about, okay, let's figure out the talking points. Let's figure out how are you going to convey this message in the best possible way. And so that's where the media training piece comes into it.
Yeah, what I did when they said they wanted me to start doing this, and they went like top. They were like, we're going to put you on stages. Not, if they'd said we're going to have you write a couple of articles, I'd be like, I'm all over that. Yeah. Like I love to write, and then I don't have to. We're going to put you on stages. So I joined Toastmasters.
Perfect. Yeah.
I first thought it was a drinking club, but it really does teach you how to speak. Yeah. So I did that and did the first 10 speeches, and it was very helpful because it kind of got me outside my head of how I was going to talk about it.
Right.
But one thing that I'd like you to talk about is the difference between giving a speech and talking to a reporter.
Yeah. Because
a speech is this long, eloquy thing or long thought out thing, but you don't have that time when you're talking to a reporter.
Yeah, and make no mistake about it, a conversation with a reporter is really not a two-way conversation. It might feel like it, but they're trying to get a soundbite out of you, a headline out of you, and your job as the interviewee is to get your key message across so that it ends up in that story.
Yeah.
So when you go into it thinking like that, you know that no matter what questions they throw at you, you're still going to get your key points across. You're still going to talk about your product, your service, your place in the market.
Yeah. So two key things there. So talking in sound bites, because people just, they don't understand that. And so tell me, what is a sound bite?
Sure. A sound bite is typically 7 to 10 seconds of you talking and then stopping. So it is a clause. It is a full sentence that gets everything in your key message into one bite of sound, as the name would suggest, so that when the reporter is going back and finding quotable items to include in that story, they're not having to wade through, as you put it, a long speech. They're able to pull quick quotes out of it and put it into the story. And so if you've done it correctly, you've come up with your key messages ahead of time. You've planned. You've rehearsed. You're ready to go. And in 7 to 10 seconds, you've given your key message.
Yeah, I think it's funny when you see the junkets when someone is bringing out a movie and they do them back to back, and everybody's asking the same questions because then they want the response or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But then there is that tricky reporter, because the reporter's not always my friend.
They're never your friend.
Okay. We want them to be, though. We were like, oh, you were having this great conversation. You're so nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how the world looks at it. So.
You have to be prepared.
Yeah.
Right. Even the softball interview can turn into a curveball in a matter of seconds. If they have an ulterior motive or they want to ask you a tough question and you're not prepared for it, they're going to catch you. And so there are a lot of traps that can happen.
Yeah, and so what are some of the traps that might be out there?
Yeah, so, the reporter might throw out a hypothetical to you that you just don't have the answer to. Well, what if, this happens? Well, so the answer is, well, I can't speak to what might happen, but I'm going to bridge to what I know has happened or what I know will happen based on the data, based on what my company does or, my service, things like that. Okay. That's one thing that can happen. They might throw out a phantom authority to you, like, hey, so-and-so says, people are saying. That's when we hear people are saying. Yeah.
Yes.
And so you're well within your right to say, well, who are they? Who are those people? What is the source of what you're asking me?
Yeah.
And if you don't have the answer, just say so. You don't have to just make up something, because that will come back and bite you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So if you don't know the answer, it's easier or better to just say, I don't know.
I don't know. What's your deadline? I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can.
Yeah. And so bridging, you use that as a term. And so what is it? What is bridging?
Yeah. So I mentioned on the outset about having your key messages ready. So regardless of the question they've asked you and you want to still get your key message across, you can then bridge to it. So say the question is, it's sunny outside. How should you be wearing shorts today?
Right.
It's a really off-the-wall question, right?
Yeah, that is.
Yes, I would like to wear shorts when it's sunny outside. But let me tell you about what we're doing here at Liger. Right now, we're working on several great initiatives. See what I did? So all I did, I took this ridiculous question. I answered it, but then I bridged back to what I want to talk about. Yeah. It's all about controlling the conversation and controlling that narrative.
Yeah, and if you want to learn that, listen to any politician, because they get asked a question and they move into some kind of thing they want to make sure they get out. And you, tell me about your childhood. It was amazing, but this, how do I kind of pull that through? Because there's this kind of game going back and forth on those conversations. And so the other thing that you hear often, this is this Hollywood thing about hey, so off the record, Mike. Off the record. So we're having this conversation and it's off the record.
Yeah, attribution is really important to know when you're going into an interview. A lot of people wrongly assume that when a reporter asks you to go off the record and you give them information, that, what that means is, well, you can use that information, but you just can't use my name. Off the record really means off the record. They cannot use anything you've said to them under any circumstances. And I always tell clients, use that sparingly. Unless you have a relationship with the reporter to the point where they're not going to burn you, don't ever go off the record.
Right.
There's something called on background, which is what a lot of people conflate with off the record, which is, hey, I've got some information for you. I don't want you to quote me, but you can say, a source within Liger tells us that this happened or that this is taking place. Yeah. And then the reporter's job really is to get everybody on the record so they can say, Eric Holzclaw with Liger told me X, Y, and Z. So, but don't go off the record if you can help it.
Okay. All right. Because you don't know for a fact. And something we've seen many examples of it, things that you think are internal can end up being in places that you didn't expect them to be?
Yes. Whatever happens inside of your company is fodder for what could happen on the outside.
And you really see on a lot of news sites recently that a lot of those internal communications become that clickbait. You know, the one thing that such and such should have done before they fired all those people, or the sympathy or whatever, right? And those are all things they probably didn't intend to end up in the public.
Right. The
public
CEO
domain.
who sent a memo to his team saying, work harder, work longer, work smarter, and then a couple weeks later he laid off about a third of the company, something like that.
Yeah.
That memo made it into a reporter's hands and became public.
Yeah.
Or the tech employee who was fired or laid off from her position, and she recorded herself and put it out on TikTok, and then the CEO was on the defensive trying to clean up that mess.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so there's a lot in this because, I mean, one of the things that we really like about the earned media component is once we've got the organic running for a client and we really want to amp it up, this is such a great way to amp it up. And, you know, people don't want to hear from the company. They want to hear from individuals within the company.
Yeah.
And so the idea of media trainings, how do I think about that as a company? And I almost now feel like I should take you on anytime I talk to anybody, I should just have you there. And I used to have a PR person who would go with me to interviews.
Yeah.
And I said I had a button in the back of in my back. And if I said anything wrong, I just would like fall over. So she could click it and I would just like pop out.
But to your point, reporters want to talk to human beings. And if you can humanize your brand by putting forward a thought leader that is human and can speak from the heart, that goes a longer way than just trying to pitch them on a sales deck.
Yeah, well, and it is such a fine line because you want someone who's safe, but you want them to be memorable.
Right.
Because, I mean, if they're safe, you don't even remember that they said anything. But if they're the person who can kind of push the line a little bit but not go over it, it's a interesting.
It's a delicate dance.
Yeah, conundrum.
Yeah.
So in the media training category, so what's a practical way to get my people up to speed? I mean, I know they could hire Petchenik Media Group, but
they certainly can. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. And something you should insist on if you're working with a group like yours.
Yeah.
Like, get them to do that. Like, don't just let them throw them out into.
Yeah, I've worked with politicians. I've worked with public sector leadership to talk about all of this stuff. I've worked with private companies as well, because it doesn't matter where you work or for whom. There's going to be opportunities for you to be out there and talking to reporters. And so you need to understand how to talk their language. I was a reporter for 20 plus years, so I understand what it was like on the other side of that camera. Right. So to your question about where do you start, it's identifying the people that are going to be doing it and then working with them, running them through practice, asking the questions, getting them to run through the motions of answering questions, getting their key messages down, learning how to bridge, learning how to understand when they're being trapped into something, and then going back and critiquing it and refining it.
Yeah, okay.
Because the more reps you get, as with anything, the better you get at it.
Yeah, so practicing it and just having somebody throw you those questions that you didn't expect or try to push you off your.
Yeah, I mean, in my sessions, we'll do a press conference, a mock press conference, where I'll start with softball questions, and then by the end, I'm asking off the wall things just to try to catch the person and see how they respond.
Right.
We do ambush interviews to see how they respond to that, and then we go back and we look at it and we say, okay, what could you have done better?
Right. And thinking about those questions that are like the impossible ones to answer, I'm trying to remember. There's like, when was the last time you beat your wife? You know, it's like, well, how do you answer that question? Right? Because you're assuming I do, and all these other kinds. So you already have put somebody back on their feet, and being able to recognize a dangerous place that they may be walking into. Yeah. The thing that's interesting about it too is that if you learn this well, I think it applies in so many other places. Like if you can do that, then you know how to do a better sales pitch. Yeah. You can give a better presentation from the stage. You potentially even network better, right? Like it's a great practice.
The foundation of media training, I think, is the public speaking piece.
Yeah.
Once you've got that down and you understand how to key message and understand that it's not just the words you're saying, but how you're saying it, your body language, so important.
Right. Yep. 100%. All right. So we're gonna go to commercial break.
Okay.
And when we get back, we're going to talk about when bad things happen. Because bad things happen.
All the time.
They're not everything's roses. You're not always covering the great story. So we're going to kind of think what Mike talks about that and how he considers that world. So you're listening to The Claw. I'm Eric Holtzclaw, Chief Strategist at Liger. I'm talking to Mike Petchenik with Petchenik Media Group. We talked in the first segment about media training, and we're going to talk in a minute about maybe when that crisis happens. What do you do about that? We'll be right back.
The Claw podcast is brought to you by Liger. Liger is a hybrid marketing firm combining a brand strategy consultancy and a production house that offers the full range of content and creative services. We can be your entire marketing department or your entire marketing department's favorite people to work with. We save the world from boring, broken marketing by putting businesses in brand therapy so they can express their most authentic, memorable selves. And then we share their story so they can be known. For more information, visit ligerpartners.com and follow us on our social media platforms.
And we're back. You're listening to The Claw. I'm Eric Holtzclaw, Chief Strategist at Liger. The Claw is the marketing podcast for C-suite executives. And one of the key components of a marketing mix is to make sure you have some earned media and you're getting some things out there to get people recognized as thought leaders, make sure your company is known. It's one of the best things you can do. Like once you get all the other stuff running, love it. It's the peso, paid, earned, shared, owned model.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tried to use the other day, I tried to say that as poet, and it's not poet.
No, it's peso.
Yeah. I called Cynthia, and she's like, yeah, you got that wrong. I'm like, so anyway,
Close.
Close. So now, I'm like, this is exciting. I'm going to get out there and I'm going to like say the things, and I'm going to get some people lined up and teach them. But bad things happen. And I'll give you an example. I talked earlier about how, this company that I was with before, I brought them in and they said that, I needed to start standing on stages. So I went through Toastmasters, and then I went through a more specialized training that's given here in Atlanta, which I thought was great. And if you do something like a Toastmasters, going and doing something on top of it really kind of pinpoints those things. But I felt bad for at least 2 people who were in that room, because there were 10 of us in the room. It was executives that they brought in. We were in like a 4-day intensive. And I was there to kind of hone my skills and whatever. 2 of those poor guys were there because their company was going through crisis. So it was like, one was a railroad and they'd had a lot of deaths on the railroad, and the other was a bank, and there was all kinds of nefarious things happening within the bank. So what they had done is thrown these 2 guys, bang, into this advanced 4-day training. They'd never been through Toastmasters, they'd whatever. Yeah. And now and this one guy, they were going to like put him on the road, and he was going to go to all the different company locations and have this conversation.
Oh boy.
Like the next week. So we're in crisis communications, and picking your crisis communications partner should happen before the crisis.
Yeah.
They should have a little understanding and knowing. It's kind of hard to hire a crisis person when you're in the middle of the crisis. But okay, let's say you did that. So as we start to prepare for the bad thing, because if I'm going to get my name out there and people are going to know that I might say something stupid or something might happen within my company. Yeah. What are some of the key things I need to think about?
Well, I think the first thing you need to understand is it's not a matter of if, but when there's a crisis. And it doesn't have to be some kind of big DEFCON 1, the world is falling apart kind of crisis. It could be something as simple as somebody got on social media and said something negative about your company.
Right.
And while that might seem small, it could blow up into a viral thing, and then the media gets involved, and then you have a full-fledged crisis on your hands.
Yeah, tons of those examples. There was one, I was at a conference, and a lady didn't agree with the terms and conditions for, it was either eBay, one of them, and she put it up on Instagram. He was like, I don't agree, and she went to bed. And she got up the next morning, and the thing had gone viral.
Oh, yeah. And
she was being requested in a conversation with the CEO like that day.
Yeah.
So what do we do to start thinking about
it? So once you come to the realization that it will happen, I think the first thing you need to do is come up with an internal crisis plan in your company. So that means identifying who your spokespeople are going to be when something happens, coming up with a war room strategy, what I like to call a matrix, a crisis matrix, which basically triages the levels of crises that can happen and what needs to take place when they do. So if it's something like a social media post, who responds? How do they respond? If it's something more serious, like an employee got in trouble and it's made the news, okay, that's a different level now. Once you've identified everybody in the room who's a part of that conversation, and you've run through different scenarios, that's another thing I recommend, is run through different scenarios internally so that when something does happen, you're prepared to just flip a switch and go. And you have a phone tree I know people probably don't think of it as a phone tree anymore, a text tree, email tree.
There's this thing called phones that used to hang on the wall, and when you wanted to get things out, you didn't text everybody. You picked up the phone, you called one person, they called somebody else.
Whatever way is going to get to everybody in the quickest possible manner is going to be what you want to do. You want to have that set up ahead of time. And then when something does happen, you have a designated person who is making the call, making the Slack, whatever it is.
Whatever the thing is, yes.
to everybody to say, here's what's going on. But here's what's really, I think, most important is once the crisis happens, everybody needs to be on the same page. Your messaging has to be uniform. You can't have one person saying one thing, another person saying another thing, and then you've got this dissonance, and you're going to get called out for that. Yeah. So it has to be uniform across the board.
Yep. All right. So uniform, which means also limited. Like, do you suggest limiting, like, who's having these conversations at that point?
I would keep it to your C-suite and to your comms people. If you have internal comms people, if you have somebody on the outside that's working with you, keep it to them. But you don't need to have everybody in the company as a part of this conversation. Because then what could happen is the phone rings at the front desk and somebody picks it up and it's the reporter from the New York Times asking about the crisis, and the person who was not authorized to speak has given a quote, and all of a sudden that's on the front page, and that's a pretty extreme
a well-placed source inside the company said the following.
Who didn't speak off the record.
Who didn't speak off the record or on background or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but no, to your point, keep it limited to the decision makers in the company.
So we talked in the first segment about standard media training, and now we move into maybe crisis communications, which is things are not good or we're dealing with something that may have a bad optic. Are there parts to that disappear? Like, are you more, or is it the same? Like, is there things that happen that you're like, yeah, I told you all to do this before, but now we do this?
I think it's a case-by-case basis. I think the foundational media training that takes place will still translate into whatever the crisis is. So if you have to go and speak to the media, you're still getting your key messages out there. You're still bridging to the positive. You're still answering and being aware of the traps that could come your way. So that doesn't go away. But I think as far as when the crisis happens, you have to decide how much you want to be putting out there. And also you have to sort of measure what the potential collateral damage might be of saying too much or too little. One thing I advise people, don't ever say no comment.
Okay.
Because that is basically telegraphing to the media that you're trying to hide something.
Yeah. Right.
So stick with what you can say. When you can't say something, acknowledge it and say you'll come back, you'll circle back to it when you're able to speak about it.
Okay. All right. Okay. So defer it. So it's like, right.
Yeah, kick the can down the road a little bit. But reporters will keep you honest, and they will come back and say, okay, well, you haven't talked about this yet. Why not? Or what's your answer on this? I mean, look what's going on with Boeing right now. It's all over the news. That's a situation where you had a whistleblower on the inside come out, and now they're on the hot seat.
Yeah.
Not just in front of cameras, but congressional as well.
Right. Yeah. Regrettably, one of my favorite things in the world to do is watch shows like American Greed and all that. So I'm always like, this kind of part of it is like, so like, how did people find out and what was going on with it and all those kind of things. So in that category, so it feels like crisis communications like is a separate thread that as a company I need to start sooner than I probably do. I wonder how many companies even have a proper crisis communications.
I would venture to say not many.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've worked at places where they didn't, and I've helped them put together the crisis communications plan. And it doesn't have to be some massive encyclopedia. Right. We're really just talking about just come up with the basics so that when something happens, and you can always build on that.
Right. Okay. All right. And so in thinking about the category of crisis communication, are there certain, I would assume there are certain categories it's more important for. So if you're in something that's already controversial in some way, or politicians probably think about this from day one.
Yeah. There are more, I guess you have to sort of decipher, how likely are you to step in it?
Yeah.
Are you in an industry where there's a lot of controversy going on, or is it pretty vanilla?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so as an expert in this category, thinking about what are some of the, meaning that you've seen people who've done things, you've been a reporter on the other side. Yeah. What are some examples of companies you think have done that well versus maybe some that didn't do it so well? You talked about Boeing a second ago, but
yeah, I can give an example recently of this was just the internal situation that became external, and then the CEO didn't handle it well. This was the tech employee who was laid off, and the issue with her layoff was that she was told it was because of her performance. There were no metrics to back it up, and then it became this whole thing. And the CEO took to social media and read kind of a canned statement that was inauthentic, and people saw right through it. And so he had to sort of clean up the mess from doing that.
Yeah.
So that's an example of not doing it well. I think if you're going to put your leadership out there after a crisis, they have to be authentic. They have to be speaking from the heart. People have to believe that they're not just up in their office, in their gold-plated throne, barking orders down at the rank and file, that they really get it, that they understand it, because people are going to see through that.
Yeah, I mean, if I start to also think about the idea that you're in the middle of crisis, getting a good steward, because like, did that CEO, was he just that tone deaf?
Right.
Like, did he push it across someone? And this reminds me, Veep, right? Like the show, and she's got all the people around her, and she had like tons of these kind of things happen, and she's got all these advisors, but that's not true in most people's world. So if I'm thinking about this, is there a way I can vet that well, or does it? Because like, did he know that? Do you know he's being that tone deaf? Like, did he? I
would like to think that a company of that size probably has a communications team, and that's who should be vetting it. So if you're a small company and you don't have that, seek outside help if you need it, or gut check and just talk to people that you trust and say, hey, how does this come across? Somebody who's maybe a little more removed from the situation, so that they can look at it with a fresh set of eyes and tell you that what you're about to do is going to have repercussions. As far as somebody who's done it right recently, it's not so much a corporation, but if you've seen the response to the bridge collapse in Baltimore, they, within hours of that collapse, all of the agencies there stood up a joint command of communications, and they're working really well together to put out one unified message. Now, the governor might be on one day, somebody from the NTSB might be on another day, and then, of course, you have the privately held company. Well, I don't know if they're privately held, but the company the ship that caused this in the first place.
Yeah.
And so they've all been sort of working in lockstep to make sure that the public is aware of what's going on. So that's an example of doing a good job in a crisis, because there weren't just lives lost. There's millions of dollars of revenue at stake, in the economy. So
different stakeholders following and carrying kind of similar supportive messages, versus often you'll see things that kind of divide.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So from an earned media perspective, if I want to learn more, or learn like what's a thing, where should I start? Like if you come to a company, because we work with a lot of companies, they're doing M&A, and so all of a sudden they went from being small to now they're big, and now they've got to think about working with an organization like yours.
Yeah.
Where do I start? I want to say in vetting like a group like yours, but like, where do I even just get smart about some of this? Because it's not a thing that's talked about often. It's I think it's the sexier part of kind of the marketing stack, but it's a later thing often, and people don't understand it as well as they could. So like, is there a book? Is there a thing? Like, how do I learn about it better?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're vetting somebody who will be helping you and counseling you on communications, you want to know about their background. Did they work in journalism?
Okay.
Were they in corporate communications? What's their background? What's their philosophy on how to handle things like this? What have they seen throughout their career that might inform how you would respond in a crisis? Or if it's just seeking earned media in general, how do they go about doing that? The kinds of questions they're asking of the clients to get them in the right places.
Yeah, and knowing that you need to have a purpose for it. So, name and print is great, but name and print where, right? Like, what does that look like?
What does that look like? What's the point? Am I, I'm trying to get brand awareness, but where and how? And
who's the audience you want to have listen to it at the end of the day? So.
And that's another thing that's important too. And you mentioned audience. When you're doing the media training piece of it, you have to understand that the audience is not the reporter who's asking you the question. Ultimately, the audience is the readership, the viewership, the listenership of whatever outlet is reporting on this. And so you need to be speaking directly to them. Yeah,
and knowing that doesn't have to be, even though we love the big names, it doesn't have to be a big name in order to hit the audience you're trying to hit. As long as it's the right authority and in that right space.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so you've been listening to The Claw. I'm Eric Holtzclaw, Chief Strategist at Liger. I've been talking today with Mike Petchenik. He is with Petchenik Media Group, and he does earned media work for Liger as well. He's very, very good in that category. Helps us get our clients' names out there in lots of interesting places. If you want to find all the information on how to get in touch with him, it'll be in our show notes. And until next time, thanks for tuning in.